Number 5. Mark Strandberg. On the night of November 8, 1976, 15-year-old Mark Strandberg was working at a bowling alley. When his shift was done, he went directly to his family's house in Bloomington, Minnesota. He said goodnight to his mother and then went downstairs to his room in the basement. The next morning, Mark didn't come up for breakfast. His sister went downstairs to wake him up, and she saw him lying on the ground. She tried to wake him up, but soon she realized that he was dead. The police were called and they examined Mark's body, and they discovered that he had been shot. Mark's family was stunned because none of them heard the gunshot. The police looked around the house and they found a broken window, which is how the killer got into the house. What the police couldn't figure out was motive. The 15-year-old wasn't involved in criminal activity, and he didn't have any known enemies. Despite the police's best efforts, the case went cold. 14 long years would go by, and then one day, in 1990, Mark's mother, Renee Strandberg, returned home after being out of town for several days. Renee had never moved, and she lived in the same house where her son had died. When she got home, there was a stack of mail waiting for her, and in it was an unusual letter. Renee opened the letter, and it was unsigned, but it confessed to killing her son. The letter reads, "When I came into your house that night, I really had no intention of killing him. The shooting was an accident. I didn't think he was even hit. I was just so scared that I ran out of the house. I hope your lives are back to normal. I didn't really mean for him to die." The letter writer said that he was just planning on robbing the house, and Mark surprised him. Renee assumed that the letter was real because she couldn't imagine another reason for someone to send her a letter like that. The writer expressed a lot of guilt in the letter, and Renee was hoping that the killer would come forward, but he didn't. The police aren't as convinced as Renee that the killer and the writer are the same person. They think it's possible that the writer is the killer, but nothing in the letter proves it with certainty. Renee says that she has forgiven Mark's killer, but she still wants the closure from him coming forward and admitting what he did. Number 4. Birgitte Tengs. May 5th, 1995 was a Friday, and 17-year-old Birgitte Tengs was attending a youth event at a church in Valnes, Norway. Afterwards, she got a ride with 3 young women to the town of Kopervik, which is about 3 miles from her home in Sund. At 8 minutes after midnight, Birgitte was seen talking to an unknown person in a car near a pub in Kopervik. Sadly, Birgitte would never make it home. Early the next morning, the 17-year-old's body was found by a sheep farmer off a deserted dirt road about a quarter of a mile from her home. She had been brutally murdered. The problems with the police's investigation into Birgitte's murder started before the body was even found. At 4 a.m., 2 hours before the body was found, a police officer was driving in the area and he found a pool of blood on the road. He checked it out, but just assumed that it was sheep's blood, so he drove off. Hours later, when they realized that the pool of blood may be connected to the case, they went back to collect samples, but it was too late. The rain had washed the blood away. When the police arrived at the crime scene, it was raining, so to preserve any evidence, they put tarps over the crime scene and then used rocks to hold the tarps down. They also got the farmer who found the body to help secure the crime scene. After a quick search, the police found evidence that Birgitte had been dragged from the road down a hill to an area behind some birch trees. They also found long strands of blonde hair clasped in her hand. The medical examiner determined that Birgitte had been raped and the cause of death was severe head injuries. No murder weapon was found, but the medical examiner thought that it was most likely a rock, quite possibly one that was used to hold down the tarps. An expert looked at the strands of hair found in Birgitte's hand, and he thought that the hair didn't belong to her, meaning that it most likely belonged to the killer. So the police started to look at suspects who had long blonde hair, and they took DNA samples from 430 people to compare it to the DNA in the hair. In 1995, DNA technology was fairly new, so it took 18 months to get the results back. It turned out that the strands of hair did belong to Birgitte, so that means that the police spent a year and a half chasing down the wrong lead. The DNA results essentially brought the case back to square one. That's when the police started to focus their attention on a 19-year-old cousin of Birgitte who was never identified. He came to the attention of the police because he lived near Birgitte, and other people called the police on him for his creepy behavior. For example, he had exposed himself at a local gym, and several of his teachers called the police because he was acting odd. In early 1997, the cousin was interviewed for 180 hours over the course of 5 weeks. Out of all those interviews, notes were only taken twice, and none of it was recorded. During the interviews, the police got him to hypothetically talk about what he would have done if he killed Birgitte. They also gave him a lot of details about the case. When he did talk hypothetically about the murder, the police arrested him and said that he had confessed to the murder of Birgitte. 4 months later, the cousin retracted his so-called confession, but it was too late. In October 1997, he went to trial, and even though there was no physical evidence against him, he was found guilty. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. His lawyer appealed, and in June 1998, he was acquitted. Several months after the cousin was acquitted, an odd thing happened. The wife of the cousin's lawyer received a strange phone call. The caller said that he was the killer of Birgitte. He stayed on the line for quite a while, and during the call he gave details about both the murder and himself. When the cousin's lawyer heard about the anonymous call, he started to look into the interviews that the police had conducted with possible suspects. He thought that the personal details that the caller gave fit a man named Robin Holt. So the lawyer wrote a letter to the police, telling them to look at Holt as a suspect, and somehow the media got a copy of the letter. Instantly, Holt became front page news. The police looked into Holt, and very quickly they concluded that it was not possible for him to be the killer. Holt ended up successfully suing the lawyer for damages. For years, the case has sat cold, even though the National Criminal Investigation Services, commonly known as CRIPOs, has continued to work on it. In 2014, they tried to get some biological evidence tested, but it turned out that the evidence was too contaminated. Then, in 2016, they picked apart the cousin's alibi and confirmed that he was not the murderer. As for who killed Birgitte Tengs, that is still a mystery. The police are hoping that the person who called the lawyer's wife will call them and turn himself in. Number 3. Thomas Roche. Thomas Roche was a big man who loved his Harley-Davidson motorcycle. He hung out with motorcycle clubs, and occasionally he went to topless bars, but he wasn't involved in any illicit activities, he didn't have a criminal record, and he didn't use drugs. In September 1991, he was 37 years old, and he had just quit one job as a supervising machinist, and he was going to start a better paying job on September 16th. On September 13th, 3 days before he was supposed to start his new job, Roche drove his girlfriend, Barbara Rondeau, to work, and they made plans to meet for lunch. Then Roche headed back to the home that they shared in Burbank, California, to install a new battery on his Harley. Roche didn't show up for lunch, and when Rondeau got home, he wasn't there either. The front door was unlocked, and the battery that Roche planned to install was still on his workbench. Rondeau became even more worried when he didn't come home all night, and she reported him missing in the morning. The police waited for a few days before looking into the disappearance. They thought that Roche would return home at any time. Roche's girlfriend and his friends thought that the police were making a mistake because they didn't think that Roche would just take off without saying anything. First off, he left his Harley behind, and he would have never have done that if he chose to disappear. Secondly, all his friends and family said that Roche was a pretty upfront guy. His girlfriend said that if he wanted to leave, he would have just said so, and then he would have gotten on his bike and driven off. Finally, Roche was excited about starting his new job. 6 days after he went missing, Roche's girlfriend got an envelope in the mail addressed to the family of Thomas Roche. In the envelope was Roche's driver's license, his credit card, and a piece of jewelry that he wore. There was also a 2-page letter. The full contents of the letter have never been released, but it starts off by saying, "I am suffering a great deal of guilt right now about what I have done, and I feel it is necessary to write about it for my sake and yours. You don't know me, and hopefully you never will, but I am the one who killed Tom Roche." The author then explains how he got Roche away from his home, and that was by suggesting that they go to a topless bar. The letter goes on to say, "He fell for it, and we arranged to meet on Friday the 13th. I must assure you that it was neat and quick. I do not think he suffered at all." The author then goes on to explain his motive, writing, "I love being in Vietnam. In fact, those were the happiest days of my life. I felt such a rush whenever I had a confirmed kill that it was hard to switch it off when I came back to the States. For 18 long years I have held this in check, despite the nightmares and fantasies about killing. This Jeffrey Beamer thing really got to me, and I wondered if I could still do it." The police think that the writer was actually referring to Milwaukee serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who was arrested 2 months before Roche went missing. The author then goes on to write, "I figured LA would be the best place for what I had in mind. I did not just want a random thing because you get caught that way, so I set up a plan." He concludes the letter by writing, "I am very sorry for what I have done, and I know that in time that the guilt will leave me. So will your pain." So far, the author's plan has been successful because he's never been identified. After Rondo got the letter, the police began to look into Roche's disappearance. They discovered that on the morning that he disappeared, he deposited 2 checks but didn't withdraw any money. The police thought if he was planning on taking off, he probably would have withdrawn some money. The police interviewed Roche's neighbors, and around 9:40 on the day that he disappeared, one of them saw Roche talking to a white man. The man drove a pickup truck, and Roche and the man were talking about something that was in the bed of the truck. The police believe that the man with the pickup truck was the person who made Roche disappear. 4 months after Roche went missing, his body was found on a remote hillside 500 miles away from Burbank in Placer County, California. He had been shot to death. Unfortunately, finding Roche's body didn't lead the investigators to his killer, and he has never been identified. Based on the items included in the envelope and the details in the letter, the police are positive that Thomas Roche's killer wrote the letter. Number 2. Beverly Potts. On the night of August 24th, 1951, 10-year-old Beverly Potts went with a friend to a park in her Cleveland, Ohio neighborhood. At the park that night, there was a community event that featured local artistic acts. The girls went to the park at 7 o'clock, but they stopped off at home around 8 o'clock to drop off their bikes, and then they returned to the park. Beverly's friend had to leave the park at 9 o'clock, but Beverly was allowed to stay until the end of the show. When the show concluded at 9:30, Beverly was seen walking across the park towards her home, which was only half a block away from the park. When she didn't make it home by 10:30, her frantic parents called the police. The neighborhood was searched, but Beverly had vanished. The problem was that the park had big trees that blocked out street lights, making Beverly Street fairly dark. Vagrants were also known to hang around the park at night. That means there were no witnesses, and she was probably kidnapped by a stranger who found her walking alone on the dark street. Unfortunately, the case went cold quickly. Sadly, Beverly's parents never found out what happened to her. Her mother died 5 years after she went missing, and her father died 14 years after that. There were several promising leads that emerged over the years, but all of them proved to be false. Then, in the year 2000, the case took an unusual turn. On July 12th, the Cleveland newspaper, The Plain Dealer, received a handwritten letter claiming responsibility for the murder of Beverly Potts. The handwriting on the letter was shaky, and in it, the writer claimed to be 82 years old, meaning that he would have been 33 when Beverly was kidnapped. Months later, in the fall of 2000, a reporter with a plane dealer named Brent Larkin received a second letter in the same shaky handwriting. In the second letter, the writer gave more details about the kidnapping, and he wrote that he would send a brown envelope with a special coin that Beverly had in her purse. The brown envelope never came. Instead, a third letter was mailed to Larkin on April 16, 2001. In the letter, the writer announced that, if he was still alive, he would turn himself in on August 24, 2001, which was the 50th anniversary of Beverly's disappearance. He would turn himself in at the park where Beverly was last seen, and Larkin had to be there. He said that 50 years was a long time to live with something like that. The police and Larkin were hoping that would mean that the case would come to an end on that day, but it didn't. 17 days before the 50th anniversary, Larkin received a fourth letter. He wrote, "Sorry I won't be able to make the appointment on the 24th. I was going to give myself up at the fire station at Halloran Park at 12 noon. I have to go in a nursing home, as I can't keep going on by myself. I have already lived longer than doctors gave me to live." And then the writer signed off the letter as, "Your friend." Larkin and the police hung around the park on the anniversary anyways, and no one showed up. The cold case detective who was working on the case, Robert Wolfe, tried every conceivable way to track down the author. DNA was pulled from the envelopes, and the only thing that they could tell was that the author was male. There were no fingerprints found on the letters or the envelopes. Wolfe also checked out all the nursing homes in the area to see if a man fitting the details in the letter had recently taken up residence, but again, it was a dead end. Larkin thinks that the letters are nothing but a sick hoax. Wolfe, on the other hand, has kept an open mind to the possibility that the writer is the real killer. However, he believes that the writer is now dead, and any secrets he had, he took to his grave. Number 1. Nell Alma Tirtschke. As 1921 was coming to an end, 12-year-old Nell Tirtschke of Melbourne, Australia, who went by Alma, was living with her aunt, her uncle, and her grandmother because both of her parents were dead. On December 30th, Alma's grandmother asked her to run an errand. She was to go to her uncle's workplace, which was a butcher shop that was less than a mile from their home. Her errand was to deliver a letter to the butcher shop and then take a parcel of meat to a customer. Alma made it to the butcher shop, but after that, she went missing. The police were called and the family stayed up all night while they searched for her. At 6 a.m. on New Year's Eve, a man and his daughter who were collecting bottles in an area called Gun Alley made a horrifying discovery. It was the nude body of Alma. The people of Melbourne were shocked by the murder, and the tabloid newspaper, the Melbourne Herald, whose editor was Rupert Murdoch's father, Keith Murdoch, whipped the panic into a frenzy. The tabloid purposely published scary and shocking headlines about the murder. With hysteria at a fever pitch, everyone wanted swift justice because they thought that their child could be next. A large reward was also offered in exchange for information. The police interviewed many people who were in Gun Alley on the day that Alma went missing. Several witnesses said that they saw Alma between 2:30 and 3 p.m. One of those witnesses was a woman named Julia Gibson. She was a former prostitute, and at the time she was working as a fortune teller who went by the name Madame Gurkha. She said that 29-year-old Colin Campbell Ross had confessed to her that he murdered Alma. Ross owned a saloon in Gun Alley, not far from where Alma's body was found. Ross was arrested 2 weeks after the murder, and that's when the police searched his house. Inside, they found a blanket with several long auburn hairs on it. Under a microscope, a government chemist compared the hairs found on the blanket to Alma's hair, and he concluded that the hairs belonged to Alma. Ross was charged with Alma's murder, and his trial started on February 20th, 1922, just a month after he was arrested. The prosecutors said that Roche kept Alma in his saloon for 3 hours, where he gave her drinks. He then raped and strangled the 12-year-old. Roche had an alibi, and there were 6 witnesses who could back up his alibi. Unfortunately for Roche, none of them were allowed to testify. The prosecution, on the other hand, had no problems getting their witnesses to the stand. Their witnesses were the fortune teller Julia Gibson and a jailhouse informant who said that Roche confessed to him that he committed the murder. The jailhouse informant had previously been convicted of perjury, and he had his sentence reduced in exchange for testifying against Roche. But the most damning evidence was the hair found at Roche's house. Another big problem for Roche was that he was publicly tried by the media before he went to court. During the trial, the Herald took the audacious step of releasing pictures of members of the jury, along with their names and their addresses. After a 5-day trial, Roche was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. Roche was both stunned and angered by the verdict. He proclaimed his innocence, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. His execution was scheduled for April 24th, 1922, 115 days after Alma was killed. The day before his planned execution, Roche's lawyer received an unsigned letter. The author of the letter said that he was the real killer of Alma. He wrote that he felt horrible for killing the young girl, but he couldn't turn himself in. If he did, the revelation would destroy his family. The next day, Roche was taken to the gallows. The government wanted to try a new style of rope for hangings, so they decided to use Roche as their guinea pig. The rope failed to break Roche's neck, and he died a horrible death. His neck was only fractured, and his windpipe was torn open. He gasped for his last breaths, and died 8 to 20 minutes after he dropped. Before he died, his last words were, "I am now face to face with my Maker, and I swear by Almighty God that I am an innocent man. I never saw the child. I never committed the crime, and I don't know who did. I never confessed to anyone. I ask God to forgive those who have sworn my life away, and I pray to God to have mercy on my poor darling mother and my family." Roche would eventually be proved right, but it would take several decades. In 1998, a librarian who wrote a book about the case had the hairs on the blanket tested for DNA and discovered that they did not belong to Alma. 10 years later, which was 86 years after he was executed, Colin Campbell Roche was granted a posthumous pardon. Sadly, the person who murdered 12-year-old Nell, Alma Tirtschke, got away with it. Thanks for watching this week's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you liked it, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. We post a new video every Sunday. Of course, thanks to everyone who already has subscribed. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We may even follow you back. The links are in the information below the video. But that's all for this week. Thanks again for watching.